So I want to welcome all of you to the Black Hills Photo Shootout virtual edition, our very first session for this new adventure. So thanks all of you for registering, and yeah, fingers crossed.
Cross our fingers.
Yeah, thanks for registering, and really grateful that all of you registered. It's a really great turnout for all of these sessions. So I'm just going to run through a couple of quick housekeeping items. And then I'm going to turn it right over because the session is 1 hour, counting these couple minutes that I'm talking. So we'll get going. You've already probably seen your mics are all muted during the whole session, so please leave those off just so that we can get through the session. And what we'll have you do is down at the bottom of your screen, there's a button for a chat button. And so if you can post questions and comments in there as we go, I'll be monitoring that. And then at the end, we'll leave time for questions and answers, and I will read questions to Marty, and you can listen for your question if we can get to it. Hopefully, we can get to most of them. And then also there's a button for reactions. So just to encourage Marty as he goes along, there's hand clap and what's the other one? Thumbs up. No, there's a thumbs up and hand clapping. So give them a little encouragement as we're going on. Let's see. So yeah. So we're recording the session here, and so just as another mention, please don't share this recording or record it now. We are recording it, and it'll be available after the event with all the other sessions. So if you can not record it on your own, that would be awesome. If just for something fun, if you'd like, please take some sort of photo of your virtual event experience here and put a hashtag BHSO2020 for Black Hills Shootout 2020, and then we can see the fun that everybody's having. And other than that, I think I got all of them. And with that, I'll turn it over to Marty DeWitt for the beginner's guide to macro photography. It's all yours, Marty.
All right, thanks, Jay, very much, and welcome all. I know we'd all would much rather be traipsing around the Black Hills doing this thing for real, but hey, this plan B is turning out to be better than we expected. So this presentation normally is about an hour and a half or so, and so we've pared it back a little bit. I'm going to kind of crank right along, so I guess keep your hands and feet inside the ride at all times. Tonight, we're going to talk about macro photography. This will be an introduction called a bug's eye view, getting up close and personal with your subjects in the photographic world. Just a quick bio, Marty DeWitt's my name, retired park ranger, 40 years of service with state parks in Vermont and South Dakota. And for more than that 40 years, I've traveled the country, never too far from my camera. So I know a little bit about photography, but I'm still learning every single day. So I welcome your comments and questions towards the end here, and we'll proceed. But basically, what is macro photography? Well, it's getting up close to your subject, a lot closer than we would normally be as photographers. And our subjects in this case are typically much smaller than we're typically used to. And the equipment has changed much over the years, but it's the same technology is in place, just a little finer tuned in this modern digital era. But it was found that by taking and extending the distance between lenses and the cameras, they were able to get a little bit more magnification and bring closer objects in even closer yet. But now in the digital age and the electronic age and the computerized age, I tell you, things have become really easy as far as macro or any type of photography goes. You can have the camera do everything for you, or you can take full control and the whole spectrum in between. So there's a little bit of something for everybody. And some of us may chuckle to see kind of the direction photography has gone, but with the advent of the smartphone, it's really changed the landscape of photography and the notorious selfie. So tongue-in-cheek sometimes, but it's a very, very accepted form of photography, and we need to keep considering that as we train people. So what should you use? Well, to get into macro photography, there's a number of different approaches you can do, and as you would expect, there's a number of different price points along the way. Probably the least expensive and easiest manner to get into it would be by using what we call close-up rings or close-up filters. Now, these are screw-on filters, much like the polarizers or the UV protective filters you use. They attach to the threads on the front of your lens, but they're actually different powered magnifying lenses, basically. And typically they come in sets of 3, +1, +2, +4 powers. The plus number indicates the amount of power of magnification, and you can stack and combine. However, the more stuff you put in front of your lens, you do have an impact on your image. So by stacking 3 of those filters, you're likely to find a little bit of degradation in your image. But it's a great way to get into macro and explore it pretty much on the cheap. The next one would be something similar to like extension tubes. Extension tubes, the philosophy again is just to extend that lens out further in front of the camera so that it gives it more of a microscope type of effect with the elements. Now with the new technology and the new extension tubes, you can see in the image that there are contact points, and some of the new extension tube sets will actually maintain your auto exposure and your autofocus features of your lens. There are some compatibility issues, but for the most part, it's going to do a good job. Now, autofocus, I'll say this right at the front end, you're probably going to find it best with your macro photography to turn the autofocus off and use manual focus as you go through this. You're going to have a little better accuracy, a little more control, but that is still an option for you. So again, the extension tube just connects between the camera and the lens and allows you that additional magnification. And it should shoot just like a normal lens if you have the proper connections. If you're really serious about macro photography, the way to go is to actually get a specifically designated macro lens. And the reason being, most lenses of any design typically have a sweet spot of focus, typically somewhere in the middle or the middle 30%. And they begin to fall off in focus as you get out to the edges. They get a little softer. Macro lenses are designed as flat field focus lens. That means they tend to be a little bit more sharp from edge to edge. Because we're so close, we're filling the frame with our subject, we want to maintain that sharpness. And because when you get closer to your subject, the closer you get, that area of focus or the depth of focus really shrinks up tight. And we're going to talk about that in a few moments here. Now, you can get some really extreme lenses out there. This is a lens that I used to own. It's a 1x to 5x macro lens, 1x being 1-to-1 life size. That means a bug that's a 1/4 inch long in real life is going to reproduce a 1/4 inch long on your full frame sensor or your 35mm film frame. This one will take you to 5 times life size. It's actually an extension, kind of a built-in bellows, if you will, and a very interesting lens, but very difficult to use. And you have to have a lot of light, as you can imagine. We'll also talk about that. But this gives you an example of how extreme you can get. The top right image here was taken with a 1-to-1 macro lens, a 100mm, and the 1 to 5x will actually bring up that little indication, that little inset at the lower left. And that would be your full image captured on the sensor. So you can get pretty extreme, and you can run into some pretty crazy money too. But this gives you an idea, this little ant and the challenges of getting things in focus with macro. You can count the hairs on his butt, but his head's out of focus, and he's probably less than 3/8 of an inch long. So I could just suffice it to say that the macro world, the whole nature world, takes on a whole different look when you get up close like this, up close in person. Now, there's other techniques out there. There's old school lens reversing rings, which is just an adapter that attaches to your camera body, allows you to turn your lens around and use it backwards. Much like the old days where we used to use our binoculars and we turned them around and we looked through the big end to use them like a little magnifying glass. There's also focus stacking, which has gained in popularity in the last several years. And basically focus stacking is, and we're not going to talk about that. I don't do that as a rule. I kind of take the a little bit easier approach and try to do it in camera. But focus stacking is where you continue to take kind of like an MRI of your subject. You focus at different planes or different distances through that subject, and then in the computer through some sort of software, you stack those images together and create an image, which gives you something similar to this, where you have really sharp focus from front all the way to back, with the exception of the background. So it gives you really surreal macro photography abilities, but it's a little bit more technical. We're not, like I say, we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about doing things in the camera. But basically, it's all about light. Photography is all about light. Without light, well, we're not going to be able to do much at all as far as recording images. And I found this quote, George Eastman, of course, the father of Kodak: "Light makes photography. Embrace light, admire it, love it, but above all, know light. Know it for all you're worth, and you'll know the key to photography." So it's all about the light that you have to work with and what you do to either manipulate or use it as is. So 2 types of light that we're using with our macro or any photography. There's natural light. Of course, that's the light coming from the sun, whether it's direct light, whether it's been reflected, it's bouncing, coming through clouds, coming through trees. It takes all sorts of different forms. One thing to note about macro photography and some other types of photography, a lot of people talk about, well, you got to have bright sunshine to get great pictures. Not necessarily true. The best lighting for macro photography is that nice, soft, diffused light that you get on a cloudy day, or by putting some sort of a diffusion filter or surface between you and or the subject and the light. But you get some really soft detail if you're using that diffused light. Oftentimes that natural light's not where you want it. And so what you can do is, by utilizing either commercially available reflectors, those little pop-out discs that have shiny surfaces, you can use those, or you can do it on the cheap like me and tape a little aluminum foil to a piece of cardboard or a piece of mat board and use that to bounce light in, to fill in shadows, to get a little more light specifically on your subject. It's a great time to become creative in what you're doing. Again, you can buy commercially typed commercial products, but a little creativity goes a long way when you're trying to make your own. But of course, when Mother Nature doesn't cooperate and the natural light isn't available, or it's at such low levels that you need some help, you can always fall back on different forms of artificial light. And that's where you're supplementing the natural light, either through strobe flashes, ring lights, flash reflectors. All more popular now are the new LED lights, and they make some that actually gooseneck out in front of your camera lens, or you can hold them and adjust the power. But LED lights are steady on lights, so you can see what the shadows are going to be, what the detail's going to be, rather than waiting to catch a strobe image and then looking at it to see if you got the right exposure. So LED lighting technology, I think, is really going to take hold, especially in the macro world. But just a subtle difference. So the difference between natural light on the left, a little bit softer, you can see a little bit more of the background. When you utilize artificial light, you're going to see the background darken off a little bit because the light is really is focused on your subject. So a little bit different look. Again, the artificial light gives you that clarity and that detail that natural light might not give you. I usually, when I do these types of presentations, I always make people go through a little bit of a Photo 101 class. So we're going to step back because it's important, especially in macro photography, that you understand what those settings are that your camera is telling you that it's choosing or what you're choosing. And so as far as exposure goes, there's three things that you're juggling when you're doing any kind of photography, but really, especially in macro photography. There's a shutter speed, which is in the body of the camera. There's an aperture, which is a diaphragm in the lens. And then there's this confusing thing called ISO or ISO. And we're just going to take a few minutes and kind of highlight some of these so we can see what effect changes are going to make in your images. Of course, the shutter speed, there's a shutter curtain, a little window in front of your sensor that opens and closes at a predetermined span of time, which is called the shutter speed. And it's typically indicated in fractions of a second, although modern cameras now will take you to 30 seconds auto exposure, all the way up to 4,000th or 8,000th of a second in some cases. But most of the time we spend in this 30th of a second to 500th of a second area. Now, the shutter speed is all about motion. It's all about
if you need something, there's a guy working in that last day down there.
Oh, I think he's talking to somebody else. The shutter speed is all about capturing moving subjects. You can see on the left a very slow 1/3 of a second.
The guy working in the last
The water coming off of the waterfall is a little bit milky. It's a little bit misty. But the faster shutter speed on the right, you can start to see the detail in the water. And here, an example, a fast shutter speed would freeze the water drops of this grackle taking a bath, but yet the slow shutter speed on the right, that gives you that milky dreamlike effect of your subject that's painting itself onto the sensor. So the shutter speed, it's controlling how much light reaches the sensor by the amount of time that curtain is open, but it has a specific impact on your picture, and that's how it captures moving subjects. Now that can be a trick if you're doing a macro shot of a bumblebee that's bopping around from blossom to blossom, and you want to try to capture that. Now, while the shutter speed's doing its thing in the body of the camera, there's an aperture or a diaphragm in the lens that's opening and closing and working just like the pupil in your eye. You walk outside on a sunny day and, oh, it closes right down, it constricts down. When you walk back inside, it opens up. It's very much the same thing as what your camera lens is doing. And these aperture settings are called f-stops. And I always try to explain why it is like it is, but I'm convinced that a bunch of plumbers and nurses and electricians got together 150 years ago and said, how can we make this complex for people to understand? We'll make a small number designate a big opening. Okay, so just this is important to remember because it's kind of backwards to logic. A small f-stop number is a big opening and lots of light. A big f-stop opening or f-stop number is a small opening and it lets less light through. This is critical because your aperture is very important in macro photography. So try to get that down pat, that when you open the lens, that's a small number. Closing the lens is a big number. That'll be important here in a moment because this is the critical discussion of the thing called depth of field. And I actually prefer to refer to this as depth of focus. Think of it this way. Whenever you focus on a subject, you're focused on that subject, whatever it is. There's always a little bit in front and a little bit behind that subject that's also in sharp focus. How much of that is determined by the aperture, by the opening of the lens, this depth of field. Now here's a side view, basically. So you're standing at the left at the camera, shooting to the right. There's three subjects. You decide you want just the center subject. opening the lens as wide open as you can gives you this narrow band of focus around your subject. But let's say you wanted all of those subjects in focus, you would achieve that by closing down the aperture so that that depth of focus grows and takes in both ends of the grouping that you want. Now, this could work with flowers, this could work with wildlife, this could work with the family reunion group that you drew the short straw and end up having to photograph. So if you want to get everybody in focus front to back, keep this in mind to close down the aperture. Couple examples for you. Small number on the left, big opening. The concentration is on these flower parts here, but the background, even the petals and the leaves in the background all go out of focus. But if we decided that those water drops were important and we wanted to include those, by closing down or stopping down that lens, we gain more of the detail front to back. Another couple examples. You can see the narrow band through the train layout here, where I've chosen kind of the middle where the cars and the lighting is, but everything in front and behind is out of focus. But I wanted most everything on the Asian beetle in focus, along with the eggs and the flower, so I stopped that down to increase that depth of field. If you're doing product photography, like jewelry or artwork or something like that, it's also critical. If you want, in this case, this bracelet, this charm bracelet, I wanted to accentuate just the charm. And I did that by opening up the lens so the rest of it goes out of focus. But if you want to show the entire product, then by closing down the lens, you can acquire that depth. Now, realizing, of course, that it's going to take a lot more light as you close that lens down than what you needed with the lens wide open. And that, again, plays into whether you need supplemental lighting or you need reflectors or you need some type of light source to gain that extra light. Another example, if the subject like this flower plant, the whole plant is the subject of your story, then opening that lens blurs everything out that's competing with it. You can see how cluttered and distracting it gets on the right side when more of that is in focus. So you can selectively choose what part of your shot is going to be in focus. Now, in this case, just this little toy setup, you can selectively focus with the lens wide open, and here this front figure is sharp, but the back figure is blurry because this is the story you wanted to tell. Well, maybe it's the other story, so you selectively focus on the back and blur out the front. And you can also see the detail in the base is fuzzied out, basically, front and back. Or if you want the whole thing, by stopping down, closing down your lens, now your depth of field has made both subjects front and back in focus, and look at the pegs on the base. So you have total control simply by adjusting your aperture. Now, the third leg of the triangle, the ISO. Well, what is that? Well, many of you probably shot film in the good old days, and you bought your film at a certain film speed depending on where you were going to be photographing. If you were going to be out in the bright sun, you got a 100 speed film, or 64 Kodachrome or whatever. But if you're going to be inside, you may have gotten 400 or 800 speed. That's the same thing with the ISO in digital. It's the sensitivity, it's a numeric value, but it's the sensitivity of your sensor to light. The lower the number, the less light it needs to record an image. Here, the feather on snow, this ISO 100, I was able to get enough light to make a good exposure. But the wild onion flower under the canopy of a tree was a little darker. There was less light to utilize, so I had to increase that sensitivity so I could still get a fast enough shutter speed or the right aperture combination to get that image. Now, I don't know how many of you have maybe tried to take pictures in an aquarium. The lighting is horrible. It's very, very dark and dim because that's the way the bottom of the ocean is for these jellyfish. So I had to really crank up the ISO in order to capture this image. And I was doing this handheld, so I needed a fast enough shutter speed so that I didn't enter into the equation by moving myself and causing blur. Now, many of the modern cameras now will go from a 100 ISO up to 40 or 50,000. It's incredible now. I mean, that's taking sports pictures by candlelight in some cases. But some of the older cameras, they maxed out at like 6,400 or 12,000 maybe. And the thing to remember with your ISO is keep the ISO as low as you can to get the picture you want. The higher your ISO, the more noise you add to the image, especially in the shadow areas. That noise is the old graininess we used to see with fast films. So try to keep your ISO as low as possible to get the other settings. So again, that exposure triangle, that's what you're juggling, the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO to get a combination that's going to give you the right exposure, freeze moving subjects if needed be, or give you that depth of field that you need. Now with macro photography, I'm pretty lazy when it comes to hauling around tripods and things, but I know I should. When at all possible, since you're using slower shutter speeds for that depth of field, you should consider trying to use a tripod or some type of support whenever possible. It just gives you an additional amount of stabilization or control or steadiness to give you sharper images. Now, some of the serious macro shooters will use something called a focusing rail. That mounts to the tripod. It allows you to mount your camera to the platform, and it gives you gear-driven controls for forward and back and side to side to get precision focus and alignment. But maybe even a monopod, just a single leg, might give you that additional stability if you need to be on the move. Or, you know, like in the butterfly house where, you know, they don't want tripods set up and be tripping hazards, and you don't want somebody knocking your camera over anyway. So a sturdy support or even a bean bag. I carry a bean bag. You can put a bean bag on a rock or something like that and accomplish the same thing. Now, regardless, and again, we're zipping right through this, but I hope we're kind of hitting the gist and the high points here. Regardless of the type of equipment or camera, phone, whatever you're using, I like to discuss a few composition basics. And these are more or less what you do with your subject, how you arrange your subject in the frame to make for a more powerful image. And by powerful, I mean one that people's eye, as they're viewing your picture, their eye is going to go right to where you want it to go. They're going to comprehend the story that you're trying to tell visually in your image. You know, your images, your photographs, it's a two-way street with the people that have the pleasure of viewing them. So by arranging your subject in certain ways, you do a better job of making your images more attractive. And I do a whole series of composition types of things, and those who might be taking the introduction to outdoor photography on Saturday, we're going to go more into detail, but I've plucked a couple out that I think really have a bearing in macro photography. First one is basically beware the bullseye. We're all guilty of this as we start out. We pick up the camera, we look at our subject, we get tunnel vision. We put the subject right in the middle of the picture and we're concentrating on that. We're not looking at what's going on to the side or behind them. That's when you get people with telephone poles growing out of the tops of their heads and things like that, because we're not looking around the frame. And we're also putting things right dead center in the middle of the picture. Well, in some cases, you know, it may work. It may flatter the subject you're shooting, but in many cases, it's very static. It's not very dynamic. And by simply moving that subject off center and including other elements with that subject, oftentimes it makes it a more enjoyable and a more positive image. So, you know, try that. Just experiment with that as you're looking, and especially with flowers and butterflies and things like that. It's very easy to see them all just, you know, dead center, but play around with moving them around in the frame. Now here, for instance, you know, the body itself is pretty much centered, but the wings go off at a diagonal, and the leaf that they're on is on a diagonal as well. So it all kind of converges, leads you to the body itself. So different subjects are going to require different arrangements. And that's the one thing, there are no rules. You know, these that I'm giving you now are just some guidelines. They're suggestions to try and experiment and kind of find your own niche. And it's kind of ironic, I tell you there's no rules, and then the next picture says the rule of thirds. If there's one thing that I really feel strongly about, and I hesitate calling it a rule, but that's the phrase that they coined, but I feel very strongly that this is probably the most important suggestion. Basically, if you take any of your images as you're composing it, and you mentally create a tic-tac-toe board, whether it's vertical in this case or horizontal, draw that tic-tac-toe board across the frame, and any place that you have the intersections of those lines is where you should consider placing your subject. So placing your subject at one of the thirds is going to make it a stronger image. So the flower here with the bees coming in, if that was just right dead center and the bees were all centered, there wouldn't be much of a story here. But here we've got a bee at the third, the flower's off center, and this other bee coming in from the other side. So really it's a story, it's a visual story being told. The lower one, the flower is at the third, and the butterfly is at the other third. Nicely balanced diagonal. You know, again, I could have put this bee right in the center and just had a little bit of the flower sticking out of the corner, but to me, that wouldn't have been as interesting a photo. So again, yeah, there was a lot of luck in this shot too, and a lot of shots to get it. But in the end, as I was cropping and composing, that I chose this particular composition. Now, if you've got a subject that's moving or facing in a certain direction, always give them a little bit of room in front of them. You know, here we've got the bee coming in, we've got another one, they're nice at the thirds, but I've left it room to come in and approach. So again, part of the story. Here, this little critter is kind of looking into the chicory here, but it brings the critter and the flower into oneness in the story itself, as opposed to, hey, where are you going? You know, if your subject is headed out of the picture, your viewer's going to probably say, well, wait a minute, whoa, I haven't seen it yet. What's going on here? And they're afraid they're going to miss something. So try to keep that in mind as you've got a moving subject or it's facing a certain direction. Try to face them into the bulk of the image. And the same goes for portraits. Very similar requirement with the portraits. Now, sometimes, you know, the natural world, they're artists when it comes to camouflage and disguise. And so sometimes even getting in super close is needed to tell the story. This is some sort of an ambush beetle, and you can see why it gets its name. I mean, it blends right into the goldenrod and any hapless little bug that comes along. But again, I've arranged it over to the side a little bit and make more of the flower a story there. Now, another thing that you have the opportunity to do with macro, maybe more so than with some other forms of photography, is to share impact and use that impact, color, bright colors, filling the frame. Use that to give you that wow factor with your macro shots. Again, you know, oftentimes we see these pictures of wildflowers and they're right in the center and they're quite a ways away and all we see is this green background around it. Get in close, get up close and personal. Use that color, use that detail to fill the frame and give your image impact. And it could be from a ways away, like this lily, kind of in close with the bee, but in real close with this peacock feather, just a very small portion of that feather and the detail and the textures. Use those things to your advantage. Even something as simple as a hood ornament on a 56 Chevy can be an interesting macro subject. So, photography is all about light, composition, and most importantly, emotion. Put a little of yourself into your pictures. Again, tell a story, be different. I think that's kind of one of the things I try to strive in all of my classes is, we all can go to the same places and take the same pictures of the same stuff, but what can you do to make yours unique and make your images different than everybody else's? If any of you have ever been flower arrangers, you know that it's critical. It's a lot easier to arrange odd numbers of things than it is even numbers of things. The human mind likes symmetry. And so if you have four flowers, your mind wants those flowers to be equally spaced and in a square for whatever reason. So throw them a curveball, give them an odd number of subjects, and fill the frame and make it interesting. And sometimes, oftentimes many people just photograph the whole world horizontally. They stand up, point the camera, and shoot. They never think about going that 90 degrees into a vertical format. And some subjects really call for that. They do much better in a vertical format than a horizontal format. Some subjects can be done both ways, such as this little dragonfly. The one on the left, I wanted to show the wing detail and the translucent or transparent wings and show the whole detail. But I also wanted to get a close-up of just the head, and I chose to go vertically with that because then the wings weren't important. I couldn't get them in anyway, but I wanted to concentrate on the torso or the thorax and the head. So be creative, crank that camera around. Sometimes you can use some fun little aids, like this is a shot through one of those clear spheres or a lens ball. And it gives you that fisheye look of a scene. And when you have colorful flowers and a nice background like this, it makes for a fun experiment to play with. But creativity, innovation, again, try to be different, try to do things a little differently. And we tell people that take pictures of kids all the time, don't stand up and shoot down at your subjects. Get down on their level. And that works with pets and animals and kids and all that kind of stuff. And it works with nature as well. People don't often see the view under the Queen Anne's lace like this. And you can see how I've put it kind of at the thirds and all sorts of things. But the little milkweed beetles down here, it was just a little cluster of bugs there on the milkweed pod. So I thought I'd get right down and close to those as well. And so get down and experiment. And nowadays it's easier because many of your cameras nowadays have those flipping screens, those variable angle screens on the back. And so it's not like the old days where we had to crawl around on our bellies and get muddy and dirty trying to get those shots. Now you can just flip the screen and kind of lean over, but get your camera down low and make use of that unique angle of view that few people see. Now, one of the other things that I'm really a proponent of, and I don't know, this is kind of a phrase I coined years ago, but I know it's not original, but I always tell people to look for the picture in the picture. Again, any of you that have been to Grand Canyon, we've all gone to the South Rim, we've all stood at Mather Point, and we've all taken the same picture of the Grand Canyon. What makes yours different? Look for the little pictures within those big scenes. Here's a nice cluster, kind of a busy cluster of bluebells, but getting in and focusing on one or taking one snippet out of that overall picture is a much better result for you. Here I was trying to be a little bit artsy-fartsy by centering that flower in the middle of that dew-covered spider web, but I saw some potential to get in a little bit closer, and it's not your traditional part of the spider web that I got, but it almost looked like some kind of chain of atoms, and I thought it was very attractive as far as a little different view, a different result. And of course, the playing around from a different angle yet, trying to show the detail of the water drops. So get creative, explore all the different angles, and get in close. This one I didn't quite get the clear flower in the bubbles that I wanted, but next time I'll keep trying. But the important thing is, beauty can be seen in all things. Seeing and composing the beauty is what separates the snapshot from the photograph. I'm here to help you score a photograph and not just a travel snapshot. Look for unique patterns, textures, light and shadow that's falling across a surface. And again, get in close and fill in the detail. This happened to be a life-size sculpture of a big bear or some animal. I mean, it was 6 feet tall, but it was all made out of welded washers, flat washers. And I thought that detail and the way the light was falling on it and the contours made for a very interesting image. Look for other patterns. This lower one, people think that's snow, but that's the White Sands in White Sands National Monument in New Mexico. And that's just one blade of grass blowing around in the wind that created those circular scratches in the sand. This, of course, is that salsify, or the oyster plant that we see along the road ditches and in the prairies, that big, huge dandelion on steroids. But this is looking down into that seed tuft before it blows out to the four winds. But you can see the detail in the fronds, and just a whole different world opened up to you through the macro. Now, just a couple side notes. There are times you don't want to use a macro lens. And in this case, I was asked by a friend who somebody had captured this rattlesnake, and it's a diamondback rattlesnake, but if you look closely at it, it's pretty unique. And he wanted to document this for his website because he was a biologist and he thought this was pretty cool. Well, long story short, there's no diamonds. There's no diamonds on this diamondback. And instead of the black tongue, the tongue was half red. And instead of the cat green eye that a rattlesnake would have, these eyes were jet black. But it still had the rattle, still meant business, and was still very lethal. But he wanted a picture of the head showing this detail. And so he has the snake in a snake tongs, and I'm using my macro lens, and I'm about 3 feet away from this snake. And trying to time it, of course, the tongue goes out, it waves, comes back in, trying to time it. But the background was really cluttered. So that's my leather jacket behind him to give a dark, solid background. Well, in the middle of taking this shot, that snake disappeared out of my viewfinder, and let's just say I had a slight coronary for the moment. So this is the safety portion of our presentation today. There are times not to get too close. I also did a cataloging of lichen species that were found in one of our area state parks. You had to use macro lenses for that. It was the only way, because some of these lichens you'll never see walking by, and people pass by these day in and day out along the trails or in the parking areas, walking past rock formations. So again, it was very, very interesting learning the techniques to document the different types of spore casings and formations. And I always thought this was a neat quote. There's no better time to crop a bad composition than just before you press the shutter. Again, just to stress, I try to have you do things right in the camera and save yourself the editing time after the fact. It bugs me when people say, oh, that's okay, I'll fix it in Photoshop. Try to get it right, score the shot that you've envisioned in the camera, and save yourself that editing time. Now, a quick journey. Through my macro world, I had the pleasure of witnessing the life cycle of a monarch butterfly. And if you've seen the eggs of a monarch butterfly, they're smaller than the head of a pin on the underside of a milkweed plant. Well, we raised monarch butterflies at Palisades State Park, and we tagged and released them each year. So we had a captive audience to follow. So I followed it through with the whole hatching, developing in the egg, hatching out, devouring its egg sac. Then they become lean, mean, leaf-eating machines, basically. That's all they do is eat and poop. That's what they do. But here, if you look at this, the detail of the caterpillar's foot with all those little fine hairs, you wouldn't see those without a macro ability. And that explains why they're able to climb on anything and adhere to just about any type of surface. But here, of course, he's fed his fill and he's ready to go to the next stage, creating the chrysalis. And the beauty of these types of details, you won't see without going up close. And as it metamorphosizes, and you can look at the symmetry in nature, you'll just be amazed by accessing this close-up look. Well, then, of course, out he comes, pumps the fluid into those wings, expanding the wings, drying them out, and getting ready for its long journey to the south. So the macro photography opens up a whole new way of thinking, a whole new way of learning, and it's going to get you into places right when God's ready to have you click the shutter. Well, how'd we do, Jay? Do we keep it in there?
You're perfectly on time.
Awesome.
That was great. We had one comment and one question, so I'll read those to you.
Okay.
Question from KLB35 was, they plan to practice this during the winter. What kind of lighting should they use? They have a patio door that would provide a lot of natural light, or is overhead lighting better?
Well, actually, the best lighting I've found, and that's a perfect situation if you've got a nice glass surface on one side where you've got natural light flooding in. And if you're doing like tabletop setups or something like that, I would suggest making the best use of that side lighting from the window and then using some sort of a reflective surface on the other side to back that to, or basically to bounce that light back onto the subject from the other side. That will help to fill in shadows, give a little bit more detail, and allow you to use a smaller aperture. A tripod, when you're doing it inside, a tripod would almost be a must for that. But I think you could do a great job if you've got, and it doesn't matter if it's a cloudy day, that nice diffused light would be a plus. But if it's really bright light, maybe hanging a very thin sheet of material or something at the window to kind of soften or diffuse that light so you don't get those harsh blasts of violent light and shadow. But that's a great way to set up with natural light. Just have some reflective surface to bounce it. If you don't have, or you want to use different types of lighting, you know, a little LED, battery-powered LED light that would be a steady on, you could adjust the power of it and direct it on a little stand or a little tabletop tripod and direct it to where you need it. But that would be a fun. And also putting things on a glass surface, like putting a piece of plate glass on top of some blocks of wood or something, and putting the light underneath and bouncing the light up or shining the light up from under the subject gives you some dramatic lighting as well.
And Marty, a person could probably use a piece of white tag board or anything, different kinds of things for the reflective surface, I would imagine.
Absolutely, just a piece of foam core, a piece of white cardboard, or like I say, just tape some aluminum foil to a little piece of mat board.
I saw a tip recently on a different video that was really cool. It was use the surface of your smartphone or iPad turned off. It's got the black glossy surface, and if you're taking a picture of a little ring or something like that, it gives it a really cool light effect.
Bet. Yeah. You bet. Yeah, another suggestion, go down to your Walmart or your camping store and get one of those little $4 or $5 emergency space blankets. And some of them come with silver on one side, gold on the other, and they're that really light mylar material. Just take and cut a little 3-foot square piece off of that and then scrunch it into a little plastic film canister and throw it in your bag. You'll always have a reflector with you wherever you go, and you just unravel it, just set it on the ground, or drape it over a neighboring bush or something, or have an able-bodied assistant to hold it for you. But yeah, just get creative. Just think outside the box, and it's pretty easy to do.
I've got a couple more questions, but we have an earlier comment from earlier in the evening. Mark commented that smoky skies will make for a soft light, but there's problems with that too.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure necessarily what the problems would be, other than breathing, depending on how thick it was.
Yeah.
But it will shift the color of the light, no doubt. You see that with some of the dramatic sunsets we've seen posted, the bright, brilliant red, and I saw some that were more pink and purple.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, anything will affect the color temperature of the light. And of course, we didn't talk about white balance. Some people can handle, if you shoot raw, you can handle adjusting that color temperature in your post-processing. If you're shooting JPEGs, well, find one of your other white balance settings that gives you a more accurate rendition, or use, if your camera has the adjustable Kelvin settings, you can adjust those to fine tune it in the camera as well. But if you're shooting raw and you're using Photoshop or Lightroom, then you can adjust those too in your post-processing.
We even had that interesting color sunrise this morning over in Minnesota where I'm at.
Yeah.
To see the color of it. Okay, we've got Angie says, good presentation, thank you. And she thinks that she needs to spend some more time learning the triangle with shutter, ISO, and aperture. So that was helpful for Angie. And then Lisa is asking if we don't have any equipment that's specific to macro, can a person begin to get some macro shots, or is it just to purchase, or is it best to purchase something to help that process? What would be good for the first step in macro? Let's see, money. Well, what's the first step, I guess, if they don't have the equipment and whatnot?
Well, I guess, probably the easiest, and again, the cheapest would be to check out one of those sets of close-up filters. You can use those on any lens. You just would have to get the right size, the same size filter thread for the front of your lens. But if you have a regular kit lens or you have a zoom lens, doesn't matter, you can utilize those to get closer focusing capabilities. There are some, if a person's shopping for a lens now and can't really decide, just put a quick plug in. For all-around lenses, the Tamron all-in-one lenses are really quite remarkable. They give you the wide angle to the really extreme telephoto all in one lens, so you're not carrying extra stuff, you're not changing lenses all the time. But they also have a really impressive close focusing capability. Like the new 18-400 lens, you can get up to within 8 or 9 inches, I think, of your flower or whatever, and get it's not a full 1:1, it's probably a 1 to a little less than 1:2, so maybe half size, life size, but it's pretty impressive close focusing capability. So there are some lenses that will do that just naturally without any additions or accessories. But I would say if you want to get started really on the cheap, pick up a set of those close-up full filters. You could probably get them online for $35, $40, maybe for a set of 3, depending on how big your filter size is. A set of extension tubes for your lenses, the automatic ones, about $100. You probably get to get a good macro lens, you're probably in that $600, $700, $800 range there. So a set of extension tubes for $100 is a pretty inexpensive way to dive in.
Okay. And Jane says, thank you. This was very useful. Let's see. Kathy says, is there a particular brand for the close-up filters that you would recommend?
I would stay away from the really, really cheap ones. You get what you pay for. I would make sure that they have aluminum rings, not plastic rings. And if at all, make sure they're a good quality glass. Tiffin, Hoya, ProMaster, they all make them. If you know, just kind of look them over and don't let price necessarily drive you. If they're like $15, $18 and free shipping, I would stay away from them. But you know, there's not too much that can go wrong with them. It's just the quality. You want a little higher quality glass for a better image, better light transmission.
Okay. You're getting lots of rave reviews here, Marty. Joan says, great info, now to go practice. Lisa says, thanks, this was very helpful. And Carol also said, thank you, this was great. So I would agree with all those comments.
Well, great, my pleasure. Well, it was a great maiden voyage, so let the games begin.
Yes.
You know, I think everybody, you know, I always have an open door policy. I didn't mention this, but after I retired from my state park work, I've been at Harold's Photo here in Sioux Falls for about the last 6 years, 7 years. And I teach all their classes and do workshops and things like that there. But it's an open door policy. I mean, anybody that's had to put up with listening to me for an hour, least I could do is entertain phone calls or emails, or I'm on Facebook through the Sioux Falls Camera Club. There's numerous ways to contact me. Feel free anytime. Give me a shout. Let me know if you're struggling with something. Let's work it out. I'm more than happy. I really enjoy doing this. So don't be bashful. Don't hesitate to look me up.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Marty. We're within a couple of minutes here, so we haven't had any new questions coming in, so I think it's safe to wrap it up.
Okay. Well,
thanks for the awesome presentation. Yeah. Thanks everybody for coming.
Enjoy your other programs.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Jay.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. See